This book would have been better titled How I Learned to Hate Class and Love Derrida.
This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Lillian. Here with me today is Will, Owen, and Gil. Welcome, guys.
Hey.
Hey. Hello.
So we have a very special treat for you all today. We're going to be discussing a book called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Now, if you don't know about this book, I'll just say that implicitly or explicitly, every post-1990s leftist fad has accepted the basic premises that are set forward in this book. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really sure that the authors intended it to have the kind of effect that it did, but here's where we are. It's the landmark text of post-Marxism, which was a sort of declaration by the postmodern left that we needed to leave class analysis and, interests behind as ways of thinking about politics. So do you guys remember when Cardi B threw that shoe at Nicki Minaj?
Wait, this is where we're started? Oh my God, thank you.
Do you guys remember?
Why not?
Yes.
Okay. And did you guys know about Queen Radio when Nicki Minaj is on Queen Radio afterward addressing what had went on?
No.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so she's got her own podcast. So what I feel like is going on right now is that Laclau and Mouffe are like Cardi B, and I'm Nicki Minaj. So what Nicki Minaj said before, she was on her radio show, and she goes, "Okay, people," she got really quiet, and she's like, "We're going to get into some things, She's like, "I'm going to address all this stuff." So that's basically what we're doing.
That's
today.
what we're going to do today.
We're the Minajians. Okay, this is.
Do you like how I made it? I don't want to alienate our audience, but I just made this like a Barb philosophy podcast.
No, that will only alienate the wrong people.
Yeah, we don't need that.
In fact, we were hoping to alienate them.
Yeah, we're trying to constitute a hegemonic bloc over here.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I do kind of like Cardi though.
So I brought you guys into the Barb universe to win the cultural war, as you know.
All right, here for it.
So the 1980s were a moment, I think, when academics were feeling footloose and fancy-free about the economy. And so we have Laclau and Mouffe to thank for making things like the economy and distributive justice and the economic become sort of dirty words, so we can thank them for that. In the text, the economic is always italicized, it's an insult. So
or put in air quotes, right?
Yeah, or put in air quotes, which is an interesting way of critiquing political economy. But anyway, I think that the thing that I'm going to do first of all, and then I'll just, throw it to you guys, is I'll just say two things I think they're probably right about so that we can assess with those things out of the way. I think that they're probably right in their criticisms of Althusser. So if listeners were, in on the first episode, we had some discussion about the Althusser's way of thinking about ideology and whether or not he's successful in kind of overcoming functionalism. And I think they basically pick up on Althusser's shortcomings and really run with them. So basically, Althusser isn't very successful in describing structurally bounded agency, like how people are constrained and act in ways that are culturally and normatively interesting within the economy. And so he has weird ways of describing economic determination, like the last instance or overdetermination. And this is an awkward way of putting things. And I think that they exploit these weaknesses, and some of that is fair. I also think that there's a legitimate critique of technological determinism in the Marxian tradition, like the idea that there's a kind of an economic base that has an inevitable historical movement. There are people who thought like this, and it's worth criticizing. But having said that, I think the overall argument, I'll just put that out there for listeners if they haven't read the book and just ask you what you think about it, is that Marxism is essentialist, it's reductionist, and low-key fascist because it thinks about the social realm as a homogeneous totality, and it can't conceptualize political contingency and agency. And Marxism basically crumbles under the weight of new social movements and demands for equality that aren't just economic in nature. The working class doesn't even exist. And they even suggest that, in fact, the working class is like the fundamental obstacle for expanding democracy. Like the idea of the working class is an obstacle for socialist politics. So yeah, what were all of y'all's impression?
Yeah, I like starting with the things that we agree with or that we can find common cause with, because I think all four of us truly dislike where this book leads. I know I
gotta say, Gil, this was hard. This was hard to get through. Absolutely,
it was a slog.
But I do think that, so yeah, the first chapter and some of the second chapter, the book's got 4, I think has some genuinely worthwhile criticisms of early 20th century Marxist theory. And the problem that they identify is that on like a kind of classical or orthodox Marxist understanding, the idea is that the proletariat or the working class will become increasingly unified with the development of capitalism. But instead, what we see instead is a sort of increasing fragmentation of the working class. And then there's a sort of, this is what they refer to as like the crisis of Marxism. And this can be responded to in a couple of different ways. And what they try to trace in the first chapter with their readings of like Kautsky and Bernstein, and even like, you know, Gramsci in some ways,
Lenin,
Lenin totally, is that like in each case what we end up with is a sort of disarticulation of economics and politics and a sort of increasing autonomy of the political, as they put it. And so what ends up needing to happen then is saying something like, okay, yes, the working class is not unified, it's increasingly fragmented, and then what needs to happen is a sort of political unification or some sort of political movement to unify them. And their argument is, when that happens, though, all of these Marxist theorists claim that the unity that's thereby secured has an economic or class character, and their argument is that it doesn't necessarily have to have that. And so, like, there's a sort of essentialism, like you said, and the two sort of basic problems that they see with all of these theories is, on the one hand, sort of a priori, given an essential or immutable unity or identity of the working class or the subject of politics, which they think is illegitimate. And then there's this other problem, which is the sort of teleological conception of the inevitability of socialism or whatever. So that all sounds right, broadly speaking. I think that a lot of that tracks as far as I'm concerned. I do have issues, though, with the conclusion that they draw from this, which is that, I don't know, they jettison class almost entirely as something that can provide a sort of fundamental point of reference or framework for making sense of political struggles. And then there's other issues that we can get into later about, like, yeah, like I said, where they lead, I think, is problematic.
Yeah, or to put that differently, they look at all of those attempts to try to kind of, you know, bridge the chasm that's been created in the crisis of Marxism. You know, the general strike might be one way, because they bring up Rosa Luxemburg, right? The general strike might be one way to unify the working class, right. Or they look at the kind of Leninist model of a party vanguard that becomes politically authoritarian in order to compensate for the lack of cohesive unity on the economic side. And they run through George Sorel as well, the idea of the, you know, forming a bloc or something. And so they run through, and it's actually the part of the book I like the most, which is really not saying that much, but the part of the book I like the most is I like that rundown of that, you know, the typology of the various attempts to deal with this chasm that emerges between the economic and the political.
Yeah.
The weird thing to me, though, is that they don't, like, I almost don't know why they include that in this book, because they don't then go on to say, okay, here's another way we're going to try to, like, you know, frame unity. Instead, what they do is they just seem to say, you know what, we're going to just lean into the fragmentation. Like fuck it. There's no, there's no way to build, this. It feels to me like there's no way to build any kind of large, solidarity across social groups or segments of society. And so they just decide as good post-structuralists to like lean into differentiation and dislocation. And
yeah, it feels like a trick that the book has the phrase socialist strategy in its title.
Why?
Like where is strategy in any of where we land? So they end up saying things that like, they're trying to rework Gramsci's concepts of like hegemony, and picking up on some Althusserian concepts like overdetermination. And their claim is something like there's the social is this like field of differences, and it's very post-structuralist sort of, coming out of like Saussure and whatever, where like this like everything is this sort of like play of like differential signifiers, and hegemony is this practice of articulating them into a sort of like provisional totality, but with the understanding that it's never a closed one. It's never a final totality, and there is no ultimate essence or anything like this. And so I don't know why socialist? One like stupid question to ask about this book is like, I actually don't see any analysis in anything that they write in 200 pages about like why capitalism is bad and why socialism would be good.
Why not?
I don't know.
Yeah, why not democratic strategy or something?
Yeah. They've also got like a real fetish for democracy that I'm sort of uncomfortable with.
But you're not a pluralist?
Oh boy. Oh no, the Platonism's about to come out, I worry.
I just feel like if we got, just a couple philosopher kings in charge.
Just a couple.
Just a few.
I actually kind of thought like, this book would have been better titled "How I Learned to Hate Class and Love Derrida." I mean, it is wild that now that we've gone through the things that we like, and of course, listeners, you were here for our Stuart Hall episode. The idea that in the political reality, in the political realm, there's multiple determinations. It's not simply monocausal. The idea of the economic base and superstructures. I'm here with that, but I just don't know what is with what feels like the ceaseless return to Derrida of linguistifying the social realm, of saying, well, there seems to be a hiatus between the signifier and the signified. So what does the worker even refer to? There isn't an essence there. There's only a play of differences, and it seemed to me that this is like almost like taking someone like Derrida and deconstruction so literally and making it act as if when we're doing politics, what we're doing is talking about these essential identities and then finding out, oh no, there's just a play of multiplicity at the bottom. I didn't understand the political reality that they were trying to.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like you eventually get there, and I'm thinking, are they talking about class as if it's only an identity rather than an impersonal process? Because I think this gets to what Gil is saying. It's just, and remarkably, in some ways, it feels like capitalism does drop off as a series of concrete practices about people's relationship to produce and reproduce themselves and their needs. It becomes a lot about, well, if you imagine there's this unified subject, there are these other sorts of struggles that happen that you're not going to realize. But what are those struggles responding to? Why are they happening? And instead, we're talking about how it turns out there is no essential subject, which cool.
Great.
Right?
The crazy thing about this is that by the end of the book, it just like descends into complete banality. Like on page 178, not that matters. I'll just read you a couple sentences. They could have been written by anybody post like 1960. The process character of every radical transformation, the revolutionary act is simply an internal moment of this process. There are not, for example, necessary links between anti-sexism and anti-capitalism, and a unity between the two can only be the result of a hegemonic articulation. But socialism is one component of a project for radical democracy, not vice versa. From the point of view of hegemonic politics, then, the crucial limitation of the traditional left perspective is that it attempts to determine a priori agents of change. Like there's a way in which, on the one hand, this could be written by any like liberal attack on the left in terms of, you know, that there's no particular agent, like, you know, we might as well, just pluralism, you know, different interest groups vying for influence in the state. Or it could be like any new left criticism of the labor movement. Like, okay, so there's not a necessary relationship between this and feminism. And it's like, did we need this book in 1985 to spend 190 pages to get to this point where you tell me what I already know? I mean, that part's really weird.
And so I do take the point near the end of the book, you know, one of the few things I liked in that last chapter, the one thing I liked is this idea, though it seems like the one time they do talk about strategy is that, you know, the left needs to start talking about, you know, concretely, you know, issues of rights and all of that. They need to start talking about what is your concept of freedom, because the problem is that the right is very good at taking those cultural issues and molding it and making their own hegemony. And so I take that point and I get it, but what I felt was missing for this is, so what is this all driving towards though? You know, so what type of, you know, vision of society are Laclau and Mouffe looking for, because they emphasize contingency so much.
So no, visions of society are teleological, and teleology is only one step away from totalitarianism, Will.
Well, I guess you dunked on me. And you know, now I've been revealed to be a totalitarian, and
well, but this is actually part of the problem. No, but this is like a genuine issue, though, right? Because like the sort of terminus of this critical, and they refer to it as a deconstruction, right? They're situating themselves as like doing a deconstruction. And
they call Gramsci as somebody doing deconstruction, and
yeah,
that's just,
but he couldn't go far enough.
It ain't right.
He still had like that class.
We have to make our intervention.
Yeah,
he still believed in the metaphysics of presence.
Damn it, he still believed people needed to eat, which is wild.
Well, I mean, I tweeted this the other day, but I actually think that it's like actually like the thesis of the book, which is that like the working class does not exist outside of its discursive articulation. So let's just argue interminably about what like freedom means. It's cool. And
it's linguistic idealism, right? That's their post-structuralism.
Yeah, and so like the thing is that like they're charged that we can't have a preconceived notion of the identity or unity of the working class, means that they reject as illegitimate any appeal to the interests of the working class. They say that like whenever you do that, you're making this weird illegitimate metaphysical posit. And if that's true, I don't know, again, why we would call this socialist as a critique. I don't know what it means to have like a socialist program or non-program, if we're being very careful, that doesn't have any relation to the interest of working people.
Or doesn't have a class core, right? Which is different than saying reduced to class, right? Yeah.
They think that like talking about interests is like basically fascist. I mean, that's like they keep saying that over and over again, like any discussion of interest that isn't just a discursive articulation. And I just had this thought that like it sounds like a faculty meeting more than like socialist politics. Totally. You know, like if you're a philosopher and you're in a pluralist philosophy department, you know, you have different people doing different things, different periods of history, and you want to get a hire, you know, you want somebody to be hired in a certain area, you kind of like coalesce with your block and you find reasons to convince everyone else in the department, even if it isn't exactly like might not be honest about exactly what you want, but you kind of create a dominant rationale to get other people to accept what you want, but it's never really linked to like a rational argument that those people might actually accept at face value. It always has to be like we're going to position ourselves to like influence the department. That's how I think they basically think about socialist politics. And I'm like, that could...
That's probably not where you want your leftist tract to be.
No. Well, this is actually, you mentioned Sorel, and like that's like the most like pernicious thing that happens in that part of the book and like that part of the influence for them is like Sorel like goes in this direction where he's like, well, the only thing that can provide a principle for unifying these fragmented or disparate sort of people is a myth. Mm-hmm. And so like then we're totally unmoored from anything like I don't know, practical, concrete, material reality. I'm sorry. Like they say things like, yeah, when we say everything is like discursively produced and there's only like effects of discourse, we are not, just idealists, and we're not just like, falling prey to like the one side of the idealism, realism debate. But I'm sorry. I don't see it. I think that that's not the case. I think that they absolutely fall prey to that. And like I said, pernicious to say. At some point, I flagged it up, and I wonder if I can find it. The one time they actually talk about like Marxist concepts specifically is like in like a 2 or 3 page critique of the idea of labor power, and it's ridiculous. They're like, Marxism has to establish a fiction that is that labor power is a commodity, and I'm like, that's not just a fiction. I'm sorry. I don't know how you can maintain that.
Can I read you something else? This will be my last paragraphs I read, but I highlighted all of this the first time I read this book, and every time I come back, I get like more into it. I circle like more things. So there's this part of the book where they decide that their intervention is going to be to tell Marxists that they don't understand agency at the point of production. Listen to this. So they say, we can see, therefore, that both elements of the economist viewpoint, obviously Marxism, labor power as a commodity, and the development of the productive forces as a neutral process, so the idea of technological determinism, that the forces of production just develop and then people adapt to those to create new social forms, these reinforce each other. Little wonder that the study of the labor process was for so long depreciated within the Marxist tradition. But that's not all, guys. It was the publication of Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital which finally triggered off the debate. Braverman postulates that it is the law of capital accumulation which lies behind the need of capital to wrest control of the labor process from the direct producer, but he, however, fails to provide a real explanation why this is expressed through an unceasing effort to destroy the skills of the workers, what's called de-skilling, and to reduce them to mere performers. Above all, he prevents this logic of domination as an omnipotent force, operating apparently without trammels, as if the economic forces available to capital did not permit the working class to resist and influence the course of development. Here, the old notion of labor power as commodity, entirely subject to the logic of capital, continues to produce its effects. I thought that was worth reading in full because that is the exact opposite point of that book. That book, like literally this is the clearest part of that second chapter, and it is the most upside down, like it's the most lucid set of sentences, and it's the most upside down thing that they say. The whole point of Harry Braverman's book is to show that it is conflict at the point of production, the constant wrestling of workers with maintaining control over the conditions of their work, and the fact that capital has to continually problem solve to try to regain control over work because workers do resist. They try to slow things down. They try to monopolize skills. They try to do things that make production less efficient. But what you buy from workers isn't a quantity of labor. You buy a capacity within a certain period of time. So capitalists have to get as much out of them as possible. And so there is an inherently conflictual process at the point of production, which is what drives mechanization and technological innovation, because they have to compete with other capitals that they know are doing the same thing. So it's class conflict at the point of production that drives innovation, not technological determinism. That is the whole intervention that book makes. And it's wild that they get the opposite reading, and that makes them go, oh my God, Braverman, they couldn't solve the problem. So bizarre.
It's also just that's in Capital Volume 1. I don't
Working Day.
Understand. Yeah, that there is this, they make it sound as though the Marxist conception is one in which capitalism develops according to its own uniform logic without ever having any resistance from workers. I don't see that in any of Marx's texts. He's talking the entire time about how there's this interplay. And so they make it sound as though, they write as though, oh, this is going to mess up the whole Marxist conception once we realize that workers also affect things. And it's that was kind of the entire point. I don't understand.
It was certainly the point of Braverman's book, and I got very animated about that because it was like a very decisive intervention, and to see their interpretation of it was so upside down.
Well, they get a lot of people upside down. Their reading of Gramsci is extremely frustrating.
Yeah, the only time their reading of Gramsci is good is whenever they're about to say something that they actually disagree with Gramsci about. Finally, that's where things get hot. And I'm like, okay, finally they're saying intelligent, they'll be like, oh, so Gramsci says this, right? At the end of the day, like there has to be a kind of binary confrontation between two camps or something. And like, but that's obviously crazy. And I'm like, oh no, okay, cool. We actually got a little bit of truth here for a minute.
So I guess I have two questions. So what does this book accomplish at the end of the day? So I'm trying to understand, going back to Lillian, your metaphor example of like being in a faculty meeting where you don't always want to give your reasons for what you're doing, but you're trying to form a block. So why do people organize on this account and all of that? So what resources do Laclau and Mouffe give us to understand? So what are people fighting for? Why would they get together? How would they come to understand each other? Because there's this constant, reference to, the meaning of the signifiers constantly shifting. It's not fixed forever. And so I get how that works at the level of language, but if I'm trying to understand why people get together and do things, I don't see how they offer an account for that, or what it would mean for people to organize and say this is what we want and this is who we are, which usually happens when people organize. So I don't even understand why anyone is struggling at all unless struggle just happens and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is, I think, a sort of weird and this is why I think part of like the sort of Foucauldian inheritance that they've got, which is that they sort of, it seems as though resistance is like an automatic feature. Struggle is like an automatic feature of the operation of power in the first place. And so like I just think that that's like a ridiculous conception. It's one of the things about Foucault that I like the least, in which I think that they adopt, right? That like once there is the exercise of power, well, there's also always already the surplus or excess, such that like there's like automatically resistance to these hegemonic forms of like domination or relations of power. And I'm like, if that's true, it's tautological. I think that a lot of like the thing like that, like a lot of the time, like I think I follow their argument, and I'm like, the only thing that you're asking me to do is to re-describe what's going on. Mm-hmm. That nothing would actually change if, like you're saying, well, like people get together and they make a concrete demand for something. Maybe it's, I don't know, a limit to the working day, or for healthcare or something. And they show up and they go, well, all right, if by that you mean that that's what this essentially is all about, then you're an authoritarian. But if you recognize that it's contingent, then it's just a cool discursive articulation, baby, and we're all good. And I'm like, I don't know what the material difference is.
It seems like they're saying at the end that there are, a set of struggles out there. They bring up the example of like ecological struggles, like urban struggles they refer to, which I'm not really sure what they mean by, but they talk about the emergence of new... Yeah, exactly. So
someone had to say it,
and then it seems like I just get the feeling that they're telling you, okay, we got these new struggles coming about, new social movements. Please don't subsume them under class categories. Like that just seems to be. I don't understand what other than that seems to be the thing, the message they leave you with.
Well, yeah, because they're socialists.
Yeah.
I mean, they do say at the end that like capital is like, it's absolutely necessary to alter the relations of production or something like that at the very end of the book. And I just thought to myself, like, why?
Well, this is actually one of the funny things, right? Like they're sort of falling on their own sword. This is the critique that they make of all the early 20th century Marxists, right? That like political struggle is reinterpreted in terms of a class conflict, and they're like, there's no necessary connection for that to have been the case, right? And then at the end of the book, they're like, anyway, so we got to do something about capitalism. And I'm like, I don't know. Why? I thought your whole thing was that there's no necessary connection there. And yet, all of a sudden, like, it's unclear. The other version of this that I was thinking about, too, is... I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go
I was
ahead.
just going to ask you, before you leave that point, okay, so I can accept, the idea that there's no necessary connection, but they want to say that there's a connection in this particular conjunction, this particular articulation. What is the difference between contingency and this being just ad hocism for a theory? Just like what is the difference between, okay, we have to always know that new things might arise, and it just being like, well, I guess capitalism still is a problem, so I guess we just should make that the central site of struggle. Like, so what allows us to hang together through different changes in context is what I am asking. And two, even with contingency, so why did these different struggles emerge then? Why did the quote unquote urban struggle emerge, the ecological struggle emerge? I don't think it's sufficient to say they emerge because, resistance happens because, power happens. And we already told you resistance happens when power happens.
Yeah. And the further question of how do you build any commonality between, or any kind of solidarity between those various different, struggles, so that you don't end up with a kind of archipelago? How do you build that commonality without indexing them to capitalism?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Right?
I don't think
Isn't
it
that
works.
the question?
Sorry to answer your question with a question, but
No, I mean, like, it's the sort of, I guess, like, I don't know. I suppose that, like, I can take the point when they say something like, the ecological struggle, like pro-environmental, environmentalism, they say, like, it could be anti-capitalist, but it could also be reactionary. It could be libertarian. And I'm like, I guess that's true, but, like, you have a preference. You have a preference. And your preference is that the environmental struggle be an anti-capitalist one. And why? And I don't think in the terms of their own argument, they can actually provide a satisfying account for why that ought to be the case. And so what we end up with is something like totally, like you said, ad hocism, just a completely tactical, not strategic, tactical alliance between various, like, fundamentally disarticulated struggles that are only ever sort of partial and detotalized, which we have to say so as not to be authoritarians. But I don't know how these are supposed to actually be articulated, which is their favorite concept.
exactly, yeah.
I mean, the crazy thing about it is that you simply have to be able to make arguments to people, and like for why you think what you're doing is right, and you can't always be creating caveats and being like, oh, but I'm actually might be wrong about that. Like, you've obviously never been to a political meeting or tried to have a discussion about people who already aren't won over to what you're saying. Like, if you think that discourse, this discursive articulation is just something that I think they think in terms of it could just be spontaneous. We're all just going to like bump off of each other in language for long enough, and what's going to shake out are different struggles. And I think they seem rather optimistic about the state of the world if that's what you think it is the case. It means that you think like in Europe, you think the class conflict problem has been solved, and you think that enough social progress has been made in other ways, and so you actually kind of feel this ascending progressive social order, and therefore it's not so necessary to make arguments because you assume that this is going to continue. But like in 2020, we know that's not true. And it's also the case that we seem to have to make arguments for redistribution. And we can't simply be making arguments like, well, maybe like we're wrong about wanting to redistribute wealth. Like I admit that's just subjective. It's just a partial reading on the situation. It's absurd.
It's a mere discursive effect.
It's just a local practice.
So you have
again, it's ironic because that's also their other critique of the Marxist tradition, is that it's got this teleological conception of history, and yet, as you're saying, Lillian, like they end up like kind of presupposing this sort of quiet progressive movement, right? This sort of, I don't know, that it's moving in the right direction. That these antagonisms are being neutralized in some way.
Being totally uninterested in the material conditions in which you live creates a situation in which you have to reinvent the wheel once you've made all of your critiques of what existed before. So the reason, aside from ideological interests, that Marxists are easy to criticize for the majority of the academy is that they actually try to say something about the nature of reality. And just like being the only person in the room that says what you believe, as opposed to
How
hypothetically,
ridiculous.
one could say, like you're in a philosophy conference and you're like, well, one could say the argument would go something like this or whatever. If you actually just say, well, I think this is wrong or I think this is right, then it's like the piranhas come around. They're like, we can attack this. So Marxists have a social theory, as we've discussed in other episodes. And it's actually one of the only social theories. So you can kind of eat it and try to corrode it and you can do all these things to it. But if you don't try to have your own social theory, then at the end of the day, you're going to recreate the problems that exist in actually thinking concretely about the world. So this idea of teleology comes back. The idea that they criticize the economism, but the whole time, like the underbelly of this whole argument is assuming that the economic and political are different things. So this is actually a structural feature of capitalism, that there's an institutional separation between the economy and other things, and it's ideological to continue to recreate this as if like talking about the economy is that's why it's called a critique of political economy, capital, So there's this way in which you just recreate all of the theoretical problems that you inherit when you insist that considering the material conditions of what you're writing don't matter.
Also, just again, like to pick up this point, like imagine you read this entire book about socialist strategy and then you go to like a factory in like Sri Lanka where like workers are like, getting absolutely destroyed by horrendous inhumane conditions and they're trying to organize and get some fucking minor gains for themselves. And you go, hey,
reductionists.
Wait, don't make a claim about your interests here because we have to recognize that this is only a partial and contingent articulation and that you don't have any essential relationship to...
Are you about to use the pronoun I? Ooh, that sounds like a little bit of presence right there.
Sounds like a priorism.
Yeah, you're going to need to jettison that with a quickness. And so can I also ask you all, I'm also, maybe it's because of my implicit love of Sartre, but everyone would rake him over the coals because Sartre's actually a fan of totalization. He thinks that's quite helpful for theoretical thinking because, doesn't mean you're done. In fact, actually, totalization allows you to get to greater insights of concreteness. What is the relationship between, let's say, theoretical totalitarianism, if we're going to call it that, and actually existing political totalitarianism? Because sometimes I feel like there's this, fast and loose way of playing as if it is theory that has led to, actually existing totalitarianisms that we have seen, which again, I feel like if you have a social theory, you have a way of explaining how totalitarianism happens, outside books and with actual people. But here, it's almost as if, there's some one-to-one relationship between if theory is totalitarian, that's going to necessarily have political effects like totalitarianism. By the way, I don't buy the idea that totalization means theoretical totalitarianism, but I'm just trying to get clear. What is the political problem here? Or what is the understanding of theory's relationship to political practice? Because maybe that will help us get deeper into the book, because they must have an understanding of what all of this is doing. It's supposed to affect political practice. I don't think it's only supposed to be a gotcha text for other high theorists.
Maybe this is just a hot take, but I think that part of the problem with this book is that it moves to thinking of theory as itself as being somehow political. So it carves out, the last chapter is like about intellectuals and workers, so it carves out this place for the intellectual. And I think that if theory has a relationship to political practice, the uncharitable reading is that they start to think about discursive articulation as political practice. And that's how we ended up with philosophy conferences full of people who think they're fighting power or something. This is really European scholars, from what they tell me, come to American conferences and they're kind of like, what is going on here? Everyone sort of thinks they're at a political meeting. And this is kind of a unique thing that they bring to the table, because it's like, if we just get the right theory. And the ironic thing about this is that that is actually really authoritarian, because it's kind of like, as soon as you have a theoretical disagreement, suddenly we have these like sharp divisions. And I think you can see that resonate throughout of a lot of the political common sense, that if you disagree with me about the definition of this or the theoretical lane that I'm in, then suddenly you're like on a different side, and no one told you who the side,
or you're problematic.
Yeah, so you're like one of the problematic people, and no one told you exactly what the sides are, but it might be like fascism versus the rest of us. Like that's always the kind of implied framework, because they cite, Karl Popper's critique from Plato to Marx, where he writes about the kind of basically people who think in terms of totality. I mean, I haven't read all of the books, but these people who think in terms of totality, they lead to totalitarianism, and they cite that, and they just seem to think it makes sense.
As if like, an argument doesn't need to be supplemented for, so how do you get from A to B? And so I find it kind of remarkable that it's as if the space of theory becomes actually almost the concrete space of struggle and war in this book.
Yes. And I think that that's built into the ground floor of the conception, right? Because once you say that any political agent is a discursive effect, well, luckily, we as good theoreticians are working in discourse, so we're already doing politics, and like the political struggle
producing
now
new
is
subjects too.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Always
like our interventions exist on the same plane as like a strike, right? And that I think, and that I think has led to some really unfortunate consequences, particularly in the field of like professional philosophy and in continental philosophy. I feel like since the 80s, and this book had probably played a really big role in that, there's been a clear kind of delimitation of or a distinction between what the kind of harmful concepts are, what the kind of harmful theoretical orientations are, and there's a real slippage between those concepts to like harm in the actual world, right? So you have this association of like teleology with violence. Everything gets associated with violence, right? So teleology gets associated with violence. Even thinking concretely about the practical world somehow is too close to you're on the verge of prescribing things in the practical world, and then you're back in the territory of violence. You're claiming to totalize and to understand the other, right? And then you're taking away otherness, right? Because so yeah, I feel like this has been one of the key texts in creating this kind of hierarchy of concepts. Hierarchy of concepts. Teleology is bad,
and I also think I don't know. I was talking to another friend about this the other day, that I think that sometimes it's as if the concept of violence gets expanded theoretically to such a point that I'm like, well, what about people who aren't sure they're going to make rent? What about people getting shot by the police? Is that cannot be on the same plane of theory, assuming maybe even only a provisional teleology.
Yes,
like that cannot be the same. And I'm just trying to understand. So, what game are we actually playing here? And so, I'm not trying to say that Le Clown Move don't think they're doing something serious, but they're not furnishing me with the material of me trying to say, so how do I actually come to understand, the world as it stands? How am I trying to, understand, these real concrete injustices that, it's almost withdrawn for me to understand that when you take away things like, well, I think there is a version of society that we at least provisionally want to struggle for, or I actually think that this has, at least a semi-common root why these things are happening. And
but even,
I am in this
even trying to understand things is like framed as domination. Right. And you even see this in Adorno, right? The concept which wants to, subsume the object with no remainder, and uses the language of violence to talk about the way the understanding relates to the world. And he vilifies the schematism in Kant.
Well, drag Kant. Okay, I get it. And this is our revolutionary work as well. Yes, of course. But
no doubt.
So I mean, I'm just trying to understand, so what is the next step from this? And maybe we could talk about, so what is democracy for them?
My God.
Because I I thought I'm on board with democracy. At least I thought. And then they dug into it, and I'm like, so where's the normative force?
So I'm gonna.
No kidding. Well, this is like a huge problem. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that I want to take back slightly what I said earlier about this being like an American Academy thing. I was thinking about the context in which like continental philosophy becomes really popular in the U.S., and so I think it has like uniquely American Academy specific characteristics where everyone thinks what they're doing is like political work and their scholarly work. But, you know, Laclau and Mouffe are also Europeans. And I think that what we're talking about in terms of just like why this kind of perspective was attractive is I think we have to remember that by the mid 1980s, the New Left had entered the academy and gotten PhDs. And the decline of social struggle broadly, like not just work. I think it's weird that it's not just the working class movement, like the labor movement that had been in decline. All social movements had been in decline by this time. I think maybe it's a little bit, people are a little bit more in denial about that mid-1980s while they're writing this, and probably the years while they're writing this book, so we could give them the benefit of the doubt. Like there was more, the new social movement still seemed new. But what we're dealing with is a generation of people that enter the academy and they continue to think of themselves like they're politically relevant and revolutionaries. And so political activism actually in a very distorted way gets confined to university campuses. Not exclusively, but the ideological production of the political left becomes encapsulated within college campuses and classrooms, and professors can think of themselves as leaders. And so that's how you get this weird dynamic when you go to, again, conferences where they're like, how do we understand this? And how do we respond? And I'm like, you guys aren't doing anything. And no shade. Like, that's not what, I'm not trying to tell you that you should be doing something you're not doing. I'm like, you are not, in fact, doing this thing that you think you're doing. It's ideological production. And as far as what they think democracy is, this is a really important question to ask because democracy, I think, became like a very serious fetish in both continental European philosophy and in critical theory, where like democracy, and it became about the procedures of democracy that would make it legitimate, and justice became like tied to democracy. And at the same time, there's all of this interest in civil society, and this is happening parallel to this whole argument in critical theory about the radical potential of civil society as this intermediate position between the economy and the state that could like revolutionize our political world.
Don't they seem to be using democracy just as a kind of stand-in for pluralism?
Yes.
Right. Like there's a pluralistic kind of hegemonic practice, and then there's, which is democratic, and then there's the authoritarian hegemonic practice, right, which, usually is class essentialist or something like that.
Yeah, well, again, like because everything's framed in terms of discourse and as discursive effects, democracy becomes a name for discursive disagreement. Mm-hmm. And so like the image of democracy we're left with at the end of the book is just like I said, like arguing over what we mean by equality. Mm-hmm. And disagreement is like de facto good in this regard. And I guess I suppose that like in as much as that means like not a priori shutting down conversation or debate or criticism, like fine, but that's also a completely hollow and formal conception of democracy that like is purely discursive and like, I don't know, idealistic.
But is that effective democracy? And by that I mean, so it's you're able to have these disagreements and all of that, but how does this hegemonic form of democracy have any power?
It doesn't.
Where does its power
I think that's what that kind of answers my question. I think because it seems to me that democracy is a kind of ethos for them. It's not really a political project. It's a kind of way of relating to difference, a way of relating to different kinds of struggle in a kind of non-subsumptive way or something. But the question I wanted to ask was that, like, given that, I think we're all down with a broadly pluralistic account of politics. I don't think any of us really aspires to be kind of, well, maybe Gil does, a kind of authoritarian, since you'll have philosopher kings, but
you.
but they want this kind of pluralistic democratic politics without a class core. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we do, and I do want to maintain, so I accept the pluralism, right? But do want to maintain a kind of class core, largely because I think the class element is the one part of all of these struggles that seems always the most difficult for existing power structures to subsume and assimilate, right? There's lots that capital and the state knows what to do with liberal identity politics. It knows what to do with demands for inclusion, or it knows what to do with stuff like that. It knows how to subsume them. But the class core is always this unsubsumable kernel. So how do you? I don't know. So how? I mean, I guess at this point you have to leave behind the project of this book in order to articulate how you have a genuinely pluralistic, democratic in this sense, politics with a class core, but that isn't the reductionist, the kind of reductionist thing that not just in this book we've been talking about, but in Stuart Hall and in to a lesser extent in Althusser. But
another side to this too is that, like, if we're talking about like totalization being bad, well, I mean, part of the reason why, like, I think we can't jettison this idea of a class core is because capitalism is totalizing. That's not just like not just like a discourse effect. It's got this totalizing character. This is part of like the basic Marxist analysis, right? That like it expands and does try to subsume everything in a way that I'm not sure other sorts of relations of domination automatically.
That's helpful because they
move outward in all directions. Yeah,
that's helpful because they seem to collapse capitalist society with just the social, just like the idea of society as such.
I mean, what's crazy?
By the way, what's the social?
Oh,
the social is a detotalized field of partial discursive practices by which the attempt is made, although it is impossible to actually affect, to produce society, which is an impossible object.
Yeah, I don't really know what the social is.
Any further questions?
My brain only functions on the ontic level. I only know about societies. I don't understand I can't understand ontological categories like the social.
I don't know what the social is. I don't know what the political is.
No idea.
I know about politics. I don't know what the political means.
Politics, yeah.
Okay, so listen, like I feel like one aspect of this that I keep coming back to is how circular the whole thing becomes. So because they are obsessed with identity and they assume that the problem with Marxism is that it assumes identity is tied to social ontology in some way and this way, and because they assume that the working class has an identity and therefore it's going to do all these things. One really telling part of the book, aside from the Harry Braverman thing I went on about earlier, is the part where they do Eric Olin Wright really dirty. So Eric Olin Wright expressly argues that
they do a lot
class
of
is not an identity. Class is an adjective that describes a social process. That is the Marxian view. So if you insist that Marxism says that it's a essential identity in the subject of history, so on the one hand, this is a straw man, but on the other hand, you attacking that kind of, you've lost sight of the whole point of the project. Some people probably did have a teleological view of history because their moment in history made that seem to make sense at the time. But Marxists have long since disbanded with that because we, like the rest of you, were like, socialism isn't inevitable. But this is just a truism, at this point. The argument for class politics isn't about fundamentally what identity workers have. It's like, can you imagine in this country, in the United States, a vision for racial justice that does not include a redistribution of wealth? Yes or no?
No, I can't.
Can you imagine?
I want a ruling class that has 30% black people. I'm sensing we weren't all on the same page. Okay, we did not.
Okay,
say
so that
the same
was
thing.
not a discursive consensus.
No,
but it's
that's democracy for you.
That's antagonism.
I'm just gonna keep going with it because, you know, you can naysay all you want, but I'm just going to finish my point now that I know where you really stand. But, can you imagine gender justice without universal access to medical care or daycare or free public education that's adequate? I just can't imagine those things. And the argument has never been that all of those things are the sufficient condition for justice of any particular group. But get real, people. Like, what do you think is going to win these things? And then when you say, oh, we need to redistribute wealth, who's going to redistribute the wealth? Well, capitalists aren't going to do it. Who can make capitalists do it? You know, so like there's this way in which like the whole thing just comes full circle because, and then you end up being like, is there an agent that could do this? And that, you know?
Which brings me to the, you know, I think I already know, we once joked about whenever we have a consensus, we'll call it the new Chicago school position, you know, and I think we're going to agree on this. But what I found very strange, especially the line about socialism is but one component for radical democracy, I don't understand how basically, you know, socialism subsumed a radical democracy when it seems to me socialism would be a necessary condition for there to be an effective democracy. So how can people have lively disagreements, like articulable disagreements, if, you know, they're going hungry? You know, how can they have lively disagreements where they really need to hash out? So what do we want to do when the social programs that support their life are being slashed? And so it makes it seem as if, you know, oh, okay, we'll say socialism is a component to radical democracy, but it makes it seem as if you can talk about democracy without the very things you were enumerating, Lillian. You know, so what are we talking about here? And I just want to, you know, say one last thing. You know, how do you expect to win people over if you're not willing to talk about things that really would change their lives? I think that might be one of the lessons from this past election that we're starting to learn, which is you're not just going to get, let's say, Black people on board by just saying Black things at them, if I can call it that, you know, by just being like, yeah, but, you know, blackety black, right?
I don't know. You know, Biden almost won Latinos with playing Despacito on his phone.
Oh man! Oh man!
I mean, it didn't work in Miami-Dade, but
did we all remember in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was like, "Oh yeah, I always have a bottle of hot sauce."
Oh my god, I forgot about that.
And like, yo, I love hot sauce. And by the way, for those of you at home,
hot sauce.
I am at least the one visibly Black person on here, and
at least
I thought, y'all are in for a treat later episodes. But it's just like,
spoiler alert.
Who do you think these people are? And all of that. And so that's why I think it's so important to ask, like, you know, so do you really think you could, you know, envision justice without at least those necessary conditions? And again, to make it on the record again, no one's saying it would solve all the problems. No one's saying...
Well, justice as a category does not appear in this book. There's no question of justice at all, right? I mean, like, at least
or
I
a
can't
definition
remember.
of domination. Or like anything like that.
or a definition of class.
Well, no.
There's a lot of talk about class unity, but they never actually talk about what a class is.
That's true. That's true. Well, you'd have to have a conception of a relation to the means and relations of production, but that's essentialist, so that's no good.
Then you're an economist.
But by the end of the book, though, to maybe to get to your point, Will, like by the end of the book, they're saying things like the two categories that they do want to hold on to and invoke, which, you know, isn't justice, are freedom and equality. Right. And so like they're the ones that they're like, oh, this is what democracy is about in some form or fashion. I don't know how they're able to invoke these categories without falling prey precisely to like reifying these discursive practices, which are supposed to be partial, that they've said we're not allowed to do. And so all of a sudden, like, you know, they start talking at some point about like they quote Hannah Arendt, my least favorite person maybe ever, and say like, oh well, the American Revolution wasn't the important one, the French Revolution was, and to which I'm always like, why not the Haitian Revolution? But whatever.
Gil's so politically Black. I didn't even bring it
up. But honestly, but even then though, like now we're just assuming, okay, we're going to stick to the categories of the French Revolution, right? We've got our liberté and inégalité and fraternité, and it's like, why?
Well,
why?
Waving his hands
why do we
over
accept
there.
these?
Yeah.
Yeah, why accept these categories all of a sudden as providing the horizon for what democratic politics are supposed to be about, when what we've said all along in this like deconstructive critique is that no category can serve as like a foundational principle. I don't know how they're able to invoke these at that point.
Whoa.
It feels ad hoc.
Wow.
And they might be libs.
They might.
Oh, they're libs. By the way, well, actually, and the way you know that that's true is because they actually, my least favorite part about this book, in a certain sense, is that like the violence that they do to the category of antagonism.
Because I wanted to talk about that.
Because I mean, and I think it's telling that in later works, like Chantal Mouffe is going to go on to talk not about antagonism but about agonism, right? Where like the sort of oppositional or directly contradictory category character of antagonism is evacuated entirely, and we just have this sort of agonistic play of differences. And I don't understand how they can talk about this as being antagonistic in this book. It's very strange.
Can you explain the antagonism thing to me, actually?
I mean, it seems to me like they want antagonism to almost be like an ontological feature of the social. It hurt to say that sentence, but they want it to
I
be
saw the pain on your face.
Yeah, you look very
really
unhappy
hurt.
saying that.
But I think it means something like the inherent openness of the social, or its inability to totalize itself or to close itself, right? And the idea that any kind of political opposition, it can never, like, they seem to want to push back against Gramsci on this point, right? Where they say he does a really good job at opening up the field of political and social contestation by not Gramsci was very attentive to regional differences and to differences in stages of the development of capitalism and whatnot, and all these different political actors that constitute the kind of field of force relations, right? Seems to kind of open up the terrain of different kind of antagonisms in political actors. But at the end, they say he ends up kind of coming back to a kind of binary confrontation between one class, which is hegemonic, and another class still too much indexed to the economy, right? Too proletarian for them. That are going to engage in a confrontation. So that seems to be what they're against, and what they want to do with the concept of antagonism is basically, like you said, Gil, make it not so antagonistic sounding. It's like it's a kind of play of pluralities of different social groups and identities, and so that's why I think you're right to point out the fact that Chantal Mouffe later does invoke this language of agonism, which is a much more anodyne version of political conflict than I think antagonism. Like, I don't think they should be using the word, right?
They shouldn't. No, they're not using it correctly.
This is crazy. I feel like this didn't work out so well for us. Like, I really do think that this,
it's a bit of understatement.
Just like random antagonism among groups.
Oh, I thought you meant like this episode of the podcast. I was like, I think things are going quite well.
I mean, like this issue, like these kind of randomly situated antagonisms that don't have like a together logic. Like, I feel like people kind of think like that, and it's not going super well politically.
Yeah, honestly, what I got from antagonism is antagonism their way of just trying to say that the social can never close in on itself. Finally, they use that language of suturing, because honestly, those pages on antagonism, I was getting a little bit lost because it didn't look like what I thought antagonism was. Which would be some form of conflict. It seemed like it became.
Well, it's antagonism without enmity. Right. And they use the word once, right? But they said we don't mean something like social enmity, because that's obviously also totalitarian.
No good.
Okay.
Yeah, no, antagonism just, I think, comes for them to mean, because they say things like, okay, it can't mean contradiction, it can't mean real opposition.
Yeah.
So I think it just means difference.
It can't mean a cop beating someone up. Which I was like, why not? How is that not an instance of antagonism?
Oh yeah, they did use that example, and
they did.
They used this example. When a cop beats someone up, that's just like when a rock falls down. That's just kind of real objects in the world materially smashing together. That's not antagonism. I want to be like, yeah, I'm sorry, but
that's violence, by the way.
Yeah,
definitely violent. That's violence.
Yeah.
Can I read a quote to you all from a smarter person?
Oh, thank you.
The bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, but of an antagonism that emanates from individuals' social conditions of existence. But the productive forces developing within bourgeois society also create the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism. That's a little Karl Marx.
I was about to say.
I was going to guess
think
Engels,
I know that
actually,
language.
but
Yeah, actually a bit of an Engelsian flavor. But that's a concept of antagonism that I can make sense of because it has this contradictory character that involves real opposition and also in so doing articulates the conditions for overcoming the real contradictions that capitalism produces. And when you evacuate it of that character, yeah, it just ends up meaning something like, I don't know, people think different stuff or feel a different way. And I'm like, that's not antagonism.
Like one thing that Chantal Mouffe does with the agonism stuff later, I'm glad you brought that up because that actually clarified for me one of the questions I had. It's like the argument is that politics will never go away. So like the totalitarianism of theory is to make it seem like there could be a closure to politics. You know, like we overcome class divisions and therefore politics is no more. And of course, I've always wondered like why that is the conclusion. Of course, there would still be politics. It just wouldn't be the same kind of politics, but that's neither here nor there. Mm-hmm. The argument is that politics is this ongoing antagonism. Everybody's just kind of shooting darts at each other, if you will, discursively. And there's this serious struggle that's always happening. And I just think to myself that there's this real difference between, you're the one who's describing politics after the fall of class society. Like you're the one talking about politics at the other side of structural, and like, so we get rid of structural injustice that we definitely do want to end definitively. And then we could just have politics where we're like, just disagreeing with each other. Like that sounds great.
Libs.
Libs. Liberal brain.
And again, the reason why I brought up the difference between contingency and ad hoc, as you all know, this spoke to me. Where at first it seems like they reject any talk of utopia, but at the very end, they go and I'm quoting here. Now, without utopia, I guess it's utopias in scare quotes, without the possibility of negating an order beyond the point that we are able to threaten it, there's no possibility at all of the constitution of a radical imaginary, whether democratic or of any other type. And so at that point, I'm thinking, well, then you must be trying to put forward, some different type of society we'd like to replace this one with. And I'm all fine with invoking that, but everything that we've had up until that point, you have not provided the theoretical resources by which we would articulate the notion of utopia, which makes the fatal error of making utopia this abstract imaginary thing, which, by the way, I hope we do an episode on, is not the only way of talking about utopia. And so it even withdraws on the political force that utopia could have by simply saying, I guess we could imagine, a different way of life. But, you're telling us that, isn't that totalitarianism? The idea of this, different closure. And so I was just completely confused by it. It seemed like they were searching for the normative resources because it seemed by the end, well, if it's just all open plays of difference, then why would we make decisions or interventions one way or the other?
Absolutely. I had that exact same problem. I wondered at some point, okay, great. So, I'll buy this, that the political is this ongoing, it's a forever process. It'll never go away. The social is always this detotalized field.
Struggle never ends.
Struggle never ends.
Sure.
So I don't know. Let's just disagree about stuff forever. And why socialism and not, I don't know, more capitalism? I don't see any resources in their way of thinking for actually coming down on the side of socialism. Right? They've made it all so relationally differential. So completely untethered to
because they don't want to talk about materiality.
They don't.
And so I just don't understand how you can have a conception of socialism that is completely unmoored from materialism, even just the idea of materiality.
There's a piece that I think I've shared with you all in our chats at some point by Teresa Ebert called Untimely Critiques for a Red Feminism, which she writes in like 1995, in which she like reads like a ton of like post-structuralist continental philosophers who are like in this precise vein. And she's like, all I need to do to like totally rip these arguments apart is just cite Lenin. Like, you all think that you are materialists, but all you're doing is talking about like discursive forms and pretending that like, because, oh yes, we've agreed that like discourses are material, that like that's the end of the story. And it's a very idealistic way of parsing all of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So are we like pro-socialism here?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I'm still open to being convinced one way or the other because
Laclauenuffian socialism.
Yeah, no, I think we could have some more democracy about it first.
So not a Chicago. So not
argument's not
the
for me.
Chicago School consensus for socialism.
No,
not yet. We don't want we don't want to foreclose the social just yet.
Okay.
Let's leave it
I would
open
love to close
for
the
episode
social.
4.
I'm trying to close the social in the form of fully automated space communism. With, like, that's.
I
I'd
think
love
this is
to
the first time I've heard
totalize
space
the
in there.
field.
Yeah,
No, we're
it's
going
not
to
enough for it to be
space.
earthbound.
We're gonna
No,
go to space and we're gonna be communists, okay?
The whole solar system will be communist.
And there will be no debate about
Yeah,
it.
talk
because
about
I'm a
totalizing.
totalizing essentialist. You know me.
Okay.
Dang,
Well,
dang.
that does it for us today. Thank you guys. I'm gonna pull that.
All right.
The totality.
Dang.
I don't want you to be
Last
giving our
word.
audience any strange messaging about space communism. New
Exactly.
episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Left of Phil. If you like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Take care, everyone.